You know, the story begins in 1971, actually. President Richard Nixon entered a new era in global finance. He abandoned the Bretton Woods Agreement, and gold was no longer anchoring the global economy. We entered a period, a very interesting experiment of fiat currencies, anchoring fiat currencies, anchoring fiat currencies, anchoring. It's turtles all the way down. We entered into the modern financial era of no reference value at all. No gold, nothing. Just countries flailing about, entering into spurious wars, economic, theoretical policies based on nothing, and a lot of money printing. The rise of the central bank, the holy central bank, the Ben Bernanke's, the Janet Yellens of the world, who we worship as priests in front of the cathedral of money printing. Now that era is coming to a close. The era of the US dollar as world reserve currency is coming to a close with the rise of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. Is it an asset class? You're darn right it's an asset class. How do we know that? Because as people abandon the fiat currency nightmare that's given us nothing but misery for 50 years, they're plowing into fiat currencies. Is it going to 100,000? You're darn right it's going to 100,000 because there is trillions of dollars sloshing around in a cesspool called the global financial markets. There's absolutely no rhyme or reason to valuation on any of these assets whatsoever. And I saw a headline coming up here today which immediately got my attention. So the exchange Kraken, right?
Kraken, Jesse Powell.
Jesse Powell at the Kraken exchange. They have told Schneiderman in New York to pound sand, basically. They're trying to dig into all the market making that goes on in these exchanges, and they want to know how price discovery works on these various exchanges. And so all these exchanges are saying, look, we're a post-regulatory framework. We're a post-fiat currency framework. We're entering a new era. We don't need the SEC, the CFTC, any of these regulators, because we're taking this thing to another level, and it's based on a whole different valuation model. And just to give you some context of my history in all this and how I got into it, was back in 1995, 1996, I started a company in Los Angeles called the Hollywood Stock Exchange. And we were trading virtual assets with a virtual currency on a virtual exchange. And to build that technology, which was pretty new at the time, I had to invent a technology. So I invented a technology called the Virtual Specialist Technology. It has a U.S. patent. I think it's 5950176 is the patent number. And so we were having to do price discovery on virtual assets. This eventually was sold to Cantor Fitzgerald in 2001, and they moved the entire thing to their office in New York, the top floor of the World Trade Center, a few months before 9/11. So there was an inability for them to really capitalize on that going forward. They wanted to introduce box office futures contracts, and I told them at the time that this would never happen. You would never launch box office futures contracts because the MPAA, the Motion Picture Association of America, is a very guarded monopoly in the United States without any competition. And they don't like the idea of price discovery on box office. They like to control that market with an iron fist, the 6 studios in Los Angeles. And sure enough, they didn't listen. They spent $20 million trying to develop a box office futures contract. And at the last minute for the Dodd-Graham bill, or is it Graham-Dodd? Or is it Graham-Dodd? They introduced a rider into that law saying outlawing box office futures contracts. So Hollywood is the only industry in America that has this kind of protection from financialization. You can't trade a box office futures contract, but you can trade futures contracts on almost every other industry in America because they don't want the competition. They don't want the price discovery. They don't want to interrupt the flow of their model to market their way into a box office event. And I find this a bit disturbing because it says that free market economics and price discovery is selective in America. We like it in certain markets, but not other markets. And being in the news business as I am, we're constantly butting heads with regulators who are trying to tell us which news is approved by the regulators. So This idea of free market capitalism being selectively applied to some industry and not others is now also applied to the news business. So some outlets, their news is considered to be more truthful than other news, and they don't allow the public to decide what they want to see, and for the public to make up their own mind about what is informative and what is relevant to their lives. Another word for this would be propaganda. So we live not only in price propaganda and a fiat currency propaganda, but we live in a news propaganda. The major outlets in America are into the most insidious, vicious propaganda and warmongering than we've seen in decades. The idea of free markets, which I'm totally in favor of, right? It goes back to the Enlightenment. It goes back to Adam Smith. It goes back to the transition of power from the frickin' Catholic Church to the Enlightenment, to the individual sovereignty, to the rights of man. It needs to be preserved. And markets are a way to get there. Free trade is a way to get there. Anything that interrupts free trade interrupts freedom. And anything that interrupts freedom is a reversion back to neo-feudalism. And we see that happening right now in the United States and presumably here in Canada. As wealth is concentrated in fewer hands, we're having the risk of neo-feudalism on the horizon. Crypto is the answer, in my view. And it is an asset class, and it is gobbling up market share, and the US dollar is doomed. All fiat money is doomed, and any money that you keep in fiat money, keep money in fiat that you're willing to lose. Right? Anything that's not in crypto is going to vanish. The biggest bubble in the world is the US dollar. The stock market's in a bubble. The bond market's in a 300-year bubble. We haven't seen bond prices, sovereign bond markets this high in 300 years in Britain and in over 240 years in America. Think about that. It's in a multi-hundred-year bubble. When those bubbles burst, and they will, because interest rates can't remain near zero for a perpetuity to help keep insolvent banks looking like they're solvent, every single bank goes bust. Deutsche Bank is leveraged at 5,000 to 1. There's nothing collateralizing Deutsche Bank but some hamster in a vault somewhere in Munich. It's absolutely nothing. It's a mirage.
Let's get to the PowerPoint.
Damn it! Damn those banks! All right, what else we got here? Oh yeah, so what's that? That's the Genesis block. I see some applause already. This is the beginning. That's it. That's where it all started. Notice that the headline is Times in London, Chancellor on the brink of a second bailout of banks. Is that random? Did they just put that in there as a timestamp? Or is Satoshi making a comment? Well, it could be both, but I interpret it as a comment. The banking system is in jeopardy. It's a reaction, if you will. There's a very political element to Bitcoin that is not talked about that often. And I think that probably, to put it in context of where we are historically, it should be mentioned. All right, so there's Jamie Dimon, suicide banker. And people say, why do you call Jamie Dimon, a terrorist, a suicide banker? And when you think about it, the banks on Wall Street, they're cut from the same cloth as the jihadis. They misinterpret their basic text, right? So in the case of fanatical, jihadist, theocratically driven psychopaths, they kind of misinterpret the Quran. Here, Jamie Dimon totally misinterprets Adam Smith. I mean, he selectively reads books on economics to support his maniacal psychosis. Terrorists might go to madrasas. Jamie Dimon and his crew go to the Ivy League schools, which are the madrasas of our era, who teach them economic models that are dangerous and fanatical. He's willing to kill himself and others for his beliefs. So he has no compunction about putting his entire society or himself at risk by pushing weapons of mass financial destruction, as Warren Buffett calls them, derivatives. He's willing to blow himself up, kill himself and anyone around him. So he's just a terrorist with a nice suit. Initially, he was very anti-Bitcoin. Then he came around a little bit. Now he's a little bit more pro-Bitcoin because the market's moving against him. And since he has no morals or ethics or any kind of soul, he's just going to go with the market. He's just like a dead fish will go with the current, right? He's not going to swim against the current because he's inside, he's dead. He's a parasite. He's a tapeworm. on society.
Comes the tapeworm.
I'll spare you my Jamie Dimon the tapeworm impression because it's too vulgar. But just to give you an idea, well, yeah, you know, it's pretty sick. We'll move on. You know, we've been doing our show for like 1,300 episodes, and this is kind of the reaction we get. People are understanding that the enemy are the banksters, and it's not the concocted skirmishes, you know, the war, the scapegoating that goes on right now. You know, when the Democrats were in charge, you remember the Muslims were the enemy, and now that the Republicans are in charge, the Russians are the enemy. So it's all bull. The enemy are the banksters. That's our common enemy. So we got to get above the parochial, regional nonsense and scapegoating and bigotry. Wachovia, $380 billion in drug money for Mexican. Of course, they were bought by Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo, big position by Warren Buffett. Wells Fargo caught recently going into millions of customer accounts and stealing money. You know, they get a slap on the wrist. The price of fraud and terrorism in America is roughly you get penalized 10 cents on every dollar you steal. That's the penalty. That's the business model.
And what do you think of that headline in terms of Wachovia laundered $380 billion? How is that compared to Silk Road, which was used as an excuse of, you see headlines like this all the time, that Bitcoin is used for money laundering or buying drugs or things like that.
Right, so Ross Ulbricht, it was with the Silk Road. He's now serving life in jail.
Anybody from Wachovia in prison?
No. Wells Fargo.
Anybody from HSBC? HSBC built... This was in the revelation. They never went to court, so I was going to say the court case, but there was never a court case. So this was in the discovery. What happened with HSBC is that they actually physically designed like the equivalent of a trezor or a ledger. They created a physical box uniquely for the Mexican drug cartels to deliver money to HSBC branches in Mexico City. And here, they don't go to prison. They never were charged with anything.
They are given huge bonuses. And the bonuses are driven by stock options that go up in value based on the stock price, based on stock repurchases and buybacks funded by 0% interest rates from the central banks. So the central bank is an accomplice. So again, Bitcoin is fighting this fight. That's what Bitcoin is putting these guys hopefully 6 feet under. Bitcoin is the revolution. Bitcoin is the means by which there will be a lot of, as we saw in the 1930s, bankers jumping out of windows. That's part of the goal.